Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Ward, and I have the pleasure of working with the University of Washington Chamber Singers who Uldis generously asked us to sing at the opening of this convention. And we're so glad to be here. We have some hellos to say. First hello is to where we are. And the spirit of this building is greeted every morning by the curators of this space. And they greet the spirit of this room. And so I think in your favorite way, let's all say hello to this space. And from south to north, I offer you Labas, Latvian, Terich, Terre. On our behalf, the University of Washington is so glad to have you amongst us. We're going to sing a number, just 3 songs for us, really short. The first one is called Invitation to Sing, and it's by an Estonian composer, but it's a Latvian piece. It's a Bordone song that is built on a long drone. So if you were to sing this note, would you sing this note with me? Ah, so you have to sing ah, you have to open your mouth. So let's all try it. Cool. Singing that, and I will sing something over the top. It's the tune that you will hear. So one more time with me, go. And so on. And the whole song is built on that little song. And it's all about this. And the text is all about all of us. How did I get here? Did the wind blow me here? Did the water carry me here? No, I came to be a part of all of you in one big celebration. This is Invitation to Sing, a Bordone song, a drone song, by the beloved Balodis.
As
we work pretty hard. We just love all of this. The next piece is not a Baltic piece. It's a Ukrainian piece. Slava Ukraine, right? Ukraine. Yeah. Slava, glory. Also a song full of drones, but in this case it comes out of the Orthodox tradition of a drone meaning the eternity of God, and taken in today's context, the eternity of the country and the people of Ukraine. This is the glory to God in the highest, that text, and in the middle it talks about don't put your trust in leaders or in the human being, because all the things that we treasure will soon pass away with our last breath. But the glory continues. Slava. And I'd like to introduce Tiffany Walker, one of our graduate students, soon to be Dr. Tiffany Walker, to conduct this piece. Last, we would like to have you sing with us. I think all of you know this piece, or know of it at least. And if you don't, hum along. We're going to sing it 5 times. First time we'll sing this will be in Latvian, then we'll sing it in Lithuanian second, and then Livonian, and then in Estonian. And then you get to sing in whatever language you want. And then we'll hum together.
Good evening, everyone. That is quite literally a hard act to follow. My thanks to the University of Washington Chamber Singers. And welcome to all of you to the opening plenary session of the 28th Conference on Baltic Studies. My name is Brian Reed, and I'm the Dean of Humanities here at the University of Washington. I'm also a professor of English and hold an adjunct appointment in our Department of Slavic. As an uninvited guest in America's Pacific Northwest, I would like to begin my comments by acknowledging the Coast Salish peoples, including all tribes and bands within the Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, who have resided on and cared for this land and its waters since time immemorial. I would also like to recognize with gratitude that we are assembled here tonight at a very special place. wǝtë øbʔaltx၀, the Intellectual House, a multi-service learning and gathering space for American Indian and Alaska Native students, faculty and staff, as well as others from various cultures and communities who come together in an inclusive, accepting environment to share knowledge. While in this space, I would ask you to follow some advice that was given by Vi Hilbert, a tribal elder of the Upper Skagit and a revered University of Washington professor. In the preface to the short story collection, Hobu, she wrote, "No one should be made to feel embarrassed or unwanted. Genuinely appreciate difference. All life is respected. Everyone should be made to feel welcome and, therefore, important. Unwise activity," she says, "might lead to ridicule, but this is a way to help the person overcome the difficulty." Now, just as the Intellectual House is a distinctive and special place to gather, so too this conference is a distinctive and special event. Our Baltic Studies program here at the University of Washington, housed in the Department of Scandinavian Studies, has, since 1994, been teaching the Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian languages, along with the history, politics, and culture of those three countries. Under the leadership of Guntis Smitšins, a Kazikis family-endowed professor of Baltic Studies, this program has cultivated close ties with local heritage communities and achieved true intellectual and pedagogical excellence. I'm excited and proud to have so many scholars, 250 of you from North America, Europe, and Asia, gathering together for this 28th Conference on Baltic Studies. And I hope you have an opportunity to learn more both about our top flight program and the vitality of humanistic study here at the University of Washington more generally. And to add a personal note, way back in 1990, I happened to be an exchange student at Moskovsky Institute Stali i Splavov, the Moscow Institute of Steel and Alloys. Pretty weird place for a poet to be, but it was a chance to get away from my parents for summer. And it was a time just after the fall of the Berlin Wall when the Soviet bureaucracy was a bit confused and things became possible that had not been before. So I went off and did an extended stay in Lithuania where the shops were much better stocked and you could actually get things like cheese and chocolate, which I hadn't eaten for months. And it's, I think, characteristic, the first word in Lithuanian I learned was ledai, ice cream. So although I started maybe with a culinary interest in the Baltics, I began meeting everyday people in Palanga, Kaunas, and Vilnius. And it was a period right after Lithuania had declared independence, but it was not yet recognized as such by other countries. And meeting people, just hearing what they had to say at that extraordinary transitional moment, that they expected tanks to come rolling down the streets any day. They really did. But they were so buoyant and optimistic. There was a march of people that had started in Poland across the border and went to Vilnius. And there was the sense that new things were happening. The world was changing. And it was really transformative to me to see people exhibiting such bravery, but also such optimism and such sense of possibility. And I've really held on to that. particularly at a moment such as right now, when the Baltic region is in the news again for reasons that can be dangerous or depressing. But to remember the spirit of the people of the Baltic countries has always, like I said, served me in good stead, re-centered me and helped me go on. And I hope that some of that spirit lives on in this conference. Again, welcome to all of you. Welcome especially to tonight's speakers and to the board of the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies. And a special thanks to Guntis and to everyone else who's worked hard and long to make this conference possible. I'll turn things now over to our conference chair, Dr. Laura Dian.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. There was a moment I thought that this would never happen and I would never see everyone in person. So thank you so much to everyone for coming and attending a conference in person. We do have a few hybrid people, hopefully zooming in later in the conference. So welcome to the Intellectual House. A number of the other speakers have talked about the cultural importance of this venue. And I encourage you to read the information on the walls and look at the artwork that talks about the indigenous people who inhabited this land before European colonization of the Pacific Northwest. So when I agreed to organize this conference in October 2019, I never could have imagined what would unfold over the following 2.5 years. I don't think many of us did. I never thought that a global pandemic would slow conference planning to a halt, and that I would actually never be able to come to Seattle until Monday to visit any of the venues. And then the recent COVID wave has meant that in the last 2 weeks, I've had to work to transform a number of panels to hybrid panels in order to accommodate the people who are unable to travel. I also never could have imagined that Russia would invade Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. As a scholar of Latvia and Ukraine, I also never thought that I would spend most of March trying to evacuate my friends and colleagues from Kharkiv, Ukraine, the city that I lived in eastern Ukraine for a year. I also never could have imagined that on March 1st, a Russian bomb would land in the residential downtown of Kharkiv, destroying Freedom Square and the apartment that I lived in, killing 35 of my neighbors. So, in other words, the pandemic really threw a curveball. The war threw an extra curveball to many of us, and I think most scholars in the Baltic states have also experienced the curveballs with the war in Ukraine. But nevertheless, in the words of one of my favorite feminist icons, Elizabeth Warren, we persisted. So, on a lighter note, over the next 4 days, with the 28th Biennial Conference, we have 94 different events, including 66 panels, 8 roundtables, 6 workshops, 3 film screenings, 2 book panels, and 2 receptions. And we also have numerous public events like the event tonight. I just want to give a few thank yous. So thank you so much to all the division chairs who worked tirelessly throughout the past, basically 1.5 years, proposing, reviewing proposals, scheduling panels, and making the academic program a success. Thanks to Guntis for doing all the work on the ground when I couldn't travel to Seattle during the pandemic. I'm grateful to the Department of Scandinavian Studies at the University of Washington for being able to support us with the room rentals. Thanks to Administrative Executive Director Lisi, who handled all the conference registration. And I'm also thankful for her guidance. I don't know where she's sitting, there she is, for handling all the conference registration and for her guidance and wisdom organizing the previous conference. Special thanks also goes to our Assistant Director of Outreach and Engagement, Ben Gardner-Gill, for his outstanding fundraising, which really made all of the breakfast, lunch, and receptions and almost $60,000 of scholarships to students and junior faculty possible. And yeah, it was quite amazing. And we also owe our gratitude to the many academic institutions and organizations and individuals who've supported the conference program, many of which you can find information about in the back of our program. And then finally, thanks to all of you for willing to participate. For many of you, I'm sure this is your first in-person conference in 2 years. So thank you to you for taking a chance on us and traveling, many of you across the world, to be able to make this conference a reality. So I hope you enjoy the next few days here at the University of Washington and learn a bit about the Pacific Northwest and our amazing Baltic Studies program here at the University of Washington.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Dovilė Budrytė, the incoming president of AABS, and I would like to thank everybody for participating in this AABS conference opening event in a very, very special place. My special thanks to the hosts of Washibald, Dean Reed for his wonderful speech and hosting the conference, and needless to say, for the whole University of Washington, our hosts. It's my great pleasure today to introduce the plenary speakers. We have Indrek, who is a research associate in linguistics at Indiana University. He studies indigenous languages in Europe, North America, and Asia. His work in establishing a Mandan language program for children was recently the topic of a widely discussed documentary film, To Save a Language, and the film will be screened in this conference tomorrow on May 27th. I would also like to welcome Astrida Blukis. She is a former faculty member at Seattle Central College. She's the owner of cultural resource consulting firm, and she has directed extensive cultural resource studies through the state of Washington, and she continues to work as expert ethnographer for 2 Washington tribes as well. It's my pleasure to welcome Aldona Jonaitis, who has written or edited 10 books on Northwest Coast Native art history. She has been professor of art, associate provost, and vice provost at Stony Brook University, vice president for public programs at the American Museum of Natural History, and director of the University of Alaska Museum of the North. She's now retired, and she's working on a book about contemporary Tlingit art. I would also like to welcome Uldis Balodis, who's a researcher at the University of Latvia Livonian Institute. He's interested in endangered languages in general, but more specifically in Livonian, an indigenous Finnic language of Latvia, and the native languages also of North America. Uldis has studied several native Arizona and California languages, and he has published a reference grammar of the Yuki language, as well as the guide to the language, culture, and history of the Lutsis, a historically South Estonian speaking community of Eastern Latvia. So amazing, amazing work. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Dr. Dian Milligan, and she has been teaching in American Indian Studies since 2002. Dr. Milligan is an associate professor and chair of the Department of American Indian Studies, and she's also an adjunct associate professor in the English department at University of Washington. Milligan's research explores the politics of mental and physical health with attention to effect as it informs race, class, and gender in Indian country. She's the author of Therapeutic Nations, Healing in an Age of Indigenous Human Rights, as well as many other articles, chapters, and poems. Right now I would like to welcome these wonderful participants of the panel, and each panelist will present a 10-minute presentation, and after that we will welcome our discussant, Dr. Dian Milligan. So I'd like to welcome Astrida Blukis, and the title of her presentation is The Role of Archaeology in Cultural Preservation, Native Latvian and Native American Experiences.
Hello, Labdian, Lavakar. I will try to distill my life into 10 minutes. try it sometime. In 1961, I went on my first dig in North Dakota. We were student archaeologists on the Missouri River hydroelectric projects. We excavated an Arikara farming community that had been shelled by US military to help advance westward movement of settlers. All decisions about the archaeological excavation were made by the university and the Corps of Engineers. Once the dams were built, the area was flooded. No one from the local tribes was involved in the process. My professional life as a Pacific Northwest archaeologist started in 1966, when I began teaching at Seattle Central. I developed an archaeology field school program and excavated shell middens at the mouth of the Skagit River. The Skagit is in the traditional grounds of the Swinomish Indian tribal community. By coincidence or fate, the wife of the director on the South Dakota dig was an ethnographer who had worked among the Swinomish in the 1950s. She thought one should at least contact the people whose ancestry one was investigating. So I invited Swinomish tribal members to visit our excavations. I was mortified that the Indian children who visited our digs were more familiar with shellfish species than any of the crew and could identify fish and animal bones better than me. It was clear that I needed to learn a lot from the people whose ancestral places I was digging in. Thus began what is now a 55-year relationship with Swinomish people. I entered the PhD archaeology program at Washington State University in 1974 and focused my research on salmon fishing communities in Puget Sound. The sites I had excavated at the mouth of the Skagit were the basis for my dissertation. Fortunately for me, archaeologists trained at Wazoo in the 1970s were taught to develop relationships with tribes in their area of investigation. My major advisor, Dr. Richard Doherty, was directing the Ozette site excavations on the Makah Indian Reservation. The Makah community and university folk taught each other. Tribal members participated at the excavation site. Tribal elders helped put many reports of investigations in the Makah cultural context. The Makah tribe wrote grants to fund a museum to house finds from Ozette. The Makah, working with archaeologists, began to sponsor federal legislation regarding archaeology and cultural resources. After I finished my doctorate, I received the National Academy of Sciences grant to study the archaeology of fishing communities on the other side of the world, where I originally came from. I applied to study in Riga, where I knew the language. However, most of the time I was assigned to Vilnius, a short time in Tallinn, and then a while in Moscow. My language skills were limited in all those areas. The experience gave me insight in how the Soviet system worked and how government involvement in scholar exchanges was manifest. I again applied to Riga in 1986, still wanting to study Baltic salmon fisheries. I was frustrated again, as this time I was placed in Leningrad. I did manage to visit family on both trips. Those were quite adventurous. The Baltic archaeologists I met were very welcoming. It was clear they were invested in researching their own ancestry and ethnic identity. They succeeded in doing exemplary research, even though they had to work with Soviet managers. After Latvian independence from the USSR, I have traveled frequently to Latvia, visiting family and my archaeology friends. Two archaeologists became especially close friends, Jānis and Zigrida Appals, a married couple. They were scholars proud of their national heritage. Jānis would quote from stories at length and recited much poetry. He told how, based on old Latvian folk tales about villages in the middle of lakes, He searched for and found such a settlement in a small lake at Araishi. After excavating the settlement, he directed reconstruction of the floating log platforms and several houses using replicas of ancient tools. Sigrid Appala had been the director of archaeology for the city of Tsesis some 60 years. Archaeological excavations in the city provided material for a museum housed in the city's medieval castle. Exhibit details the life of both the Germanic Teutonic knights who built the castle and for the Latvians who served in the area. Both Araishi and the Tsesis Castle are national monuments. You should visit them if you ever go there. It was interesting to observe that in Latvia, archaeology is done by Latvians. This also is true for Lithuania and Estonia. Archaeology projects are a part of community life, fully supported by nearby residents. Scholars publish their findings in their native languages. Archaeology projects provided a stream of cultural continuity for Latvians before, during, and after Soviet times. In the US, most archaeologists studying Native American ancient times are non-Indians. So this kind of cultural continuity does not exist. At one time, I was told that Indian culture had changed so much since pre-European times, there would be nothing that contemporary Indian people could offer to the study of their archaeological past. I would give a really nasty look to anyone who said that to me today. It is no wonder there's been tension between non-Indian archaeologists and Native American tribes. Fortunately, my own experience has been quite different. In the 1980s, tribes became more and more involved in passing laws related to preservation of their cultural present and archaeological past. This has often put an extra burden on the tribes already overwhelmed by government bureaucracy. The tribes have persisted in their efforts. They have written grants, funded archaeological trainings for their young people, and hired their own archaeologists. Although the latter still are most often non-Indians, they must learn about the customs of the tribe they work in, and they must work within traditional protocols. All non-tribal archaeologists must consult with native tribes about their ancient places. It's a far cry from 1961. In time, my own research turned to learning as much as I could about the documented oral history of Puget Sound tribes. I've delved into original field notes, stories, and myths to find the words elders used to describe their lives as they were learning English. I also turned to learning from contemporary tribal elders. I discovered the tribal definitions of some English words were interpreted into their own cultural context. They didn't mean the same thing to native English speakers, and they meant to tribal people who were learning English. For example, Indian settlements have been called villages because villages are small. They're not very significant. In an Indian community, village means a community, not because they're small. It can be a very large village. And camps were seasonal residences, no matter the size or number of permanent structures present. Lately, it has been crystal clear white Tahoma, the Lushootseed name for all our volcanoes, is translated the mother of all waters. The mother source sustains our rivers, our forests, the salmon, the cedar, and us. Contemporary Indian culture in the Puget Sound area, in contemporary Indian culture in the Puget Sound, the items we excavated are sacred, no matter if they are small shells or bones or beautiful carvings. Findings from my excavations on Swinomish territory are housed at the Tribal Archive. Rather than create a museum for artifact display, the Swinomish chose to focus on curating their ethnographic and archaeological materials for tribal study. I expect that each tribe and region will make their own choices regarding archaeology and archaeologists. More recently, I've served as tribal ethnographer for legal proceedings. My role is to translate the archaeological and oral history past into the present non-Indian court system. In the non-Indian system, I am an ethnographic expert. I find that title really strange. I am not native here, so I struggle with that role, but I do it when a tribe asks me to. I try to channel the Indian elders I knew personally, elders whose words were documented, and the very ancient ones whose leavings I excavated. As a Baltic person, I understand being native, even if here I am not. I have this in back for you all to look at. If you'll notice the placement of the arms and hands on each of the figures, they're all carved from antler. They all come from the general Swinomish traditional area. The figures are about 1,000 years old. The gesture is contemporary at Indian gatherings. The largest figure is in the Burke Museum, if you wanted to take a look at it. ASEAN.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Aldona Jonaitis, and she will present on Lithuanian carved wooden shrines, koplystulpiai, and totem poles in the Pacific Northwest coast.
First of all, I gratefully acknowledge the owners of this land, the Duwamish, Tulalip, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot. I also thank Uldis for inviting me to this conference because it's a wonderful opportunity to be here, and actually it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to learn more about my own heritage. This is a paper, is the oh, this one. Okay. Yeah. This is a paper about the relationships between Lithuanian carved poles and Northwest Coast totem poles. Before I start, let me say that I'm a historian of indigenous art of coastal British Columbia and Southeast Alaska, having written 2 books on totem poles specifically, but know very little about Lithuanian carvings. And I'll, for simplicity's sake, call those carvings poles as opposed to the individual types. I'm 3rd generation Lithuanian, and my 4 grandparents lived in a world which treasured crosses on poles and other religious monuments. And they did talk about those. At first, I thought nothing connected these traditions. But after researching the Lithuanian versions for this talk, I realized I have 2 similarities. One, their ancient roots. The other, their responses to foreign domination. This will be a very brief and by necessity superficial presentation, and I'll be leaving out a lot of salient information that I'd be pleased to share later or by email. The ancient belief system of the circumpolar communities was shamanism, which conceptualized the world tree or tree of life upon which shamans journeyed through the lower, middle, and upper worlds. The center of this 19th century Sami drum depicts that cosmic connector. The tree of life ultimately, over millennia, inspired in Lithuania and on the Northwest Coast and elsewhere worldwide, the sacred poles, which eventually evolved into the forms we know today. Lithuanian carved poles, of which there are several variations and different names, evolved from pagan grave monuments. After Christianization, they slowly became religious shrines, albeit with certain prehistoric, i.e. pagan motifs. These came to populate not only the cemeteries, but also the countryside roads, farms, villages. Unfortunately, the authorities usually disapproved of these monuments. The Roman Catholic Church objected to their pagan elements. This was in the early time of conversion. After 1795, Russians controlled the countries and seeking to replace Roman Catholicism with the Orthodox religion, attempted as well to eradicate the shrines. And of course, the Soviets forbade them. Starting in the 19th century, Poles became more and more than spiritual presences. Because they responded to the foreigners' domination and disdain for their culture, they became both statements of Lithuanian values and resistance to authority. In 1861 and 1863, the peasants revolted only to be cruelly crushed. The survivors started erecting monuments to the dead on what became known as the Hill of Crosses, which today includes 50,000 carvings. When the Soviets started bulldozing this hill in 1961, the Lithuanians immediately, every night, replaced them. In the 1970s, artists began initiating a subterfuge to perpetuate Lithuanian culture by secularizing their pole-like carvings and relating them to the kind of historical events which the Russians could approve. In 1972, this array of monuments memorialized the slaughter of a community by the Nazis. The Russians approved of this, but overlooked or misinterpreted, or both, one inscription, quote, "To the living be diligent," exclamation point. Lithuanians cunningly were urging diligence, not of the Nazis, but of the Soviets. In 2020, Lithuanian Partisan Memorial was built to those who died during the guerrilla wars of the 40s and 50s. It signifies now a proud sovereign country. This impressive abstract sculpture expresses two themes visually: the sword of Lithuanian liberation and independence, and the cross of resistance and cultural values. Northwest Coast totem poles also initially expressed community values. This 1880 photograph of Skidegate, a Haida village on Haida, once known as the Queen Charlotte Islands, illustrates poles that stand before large multifamily houses. These carvings represented the history, past, present, and future, of the clan who lived in those houses. Images depicted beings who interacted with ancestors and gave descendants the privilege to display them. Totem poles were neither religious nor prayed to, but referenced the important supernaturals from whom came a clan's social power and prestige. Lithuanians had the Russians, Native Americans had white settlers. In Alaska, on which I will concentrate from now on, outsiders began arriving in that region, in Southeast Alaska, in the mid-1880s, confiscating indigenous lands, assuming ownership of salmon streams, and prohibiting those clans who actually owned them from obtaining their food. Missionaries and government officials disapproved of all indigenous traditions and endeavored to transform the people into, quote, civilized Christians, unquote. They thought totem poles were signs of paganism, ancestor worship, and other sins, such as adherence to tradition. Nonetheless, the Tlingit who live in this region continued erecting totem poles, like into the early 20th century. These expressed more than clan histories, although they did that too. In 1880, a Southern village chief hosted a lavish feast for Secretary of State William Stewart. He ignored proper protocol and never reciprocated. So in 1900, that chief erected a pole, and that is on the left-hand picture, the right-hand pole. He erected this pole, shaming Stewart, sitting on the top of the pole, for his grievous insult. This expression of cultural pride, clan history, and early criticism of colonials stood in the village for decades until it deteriorated in a moist Southeast Alaskan climate. Tlingit artists replicated it twice, first in 1940, the one in the slide in the middle, and in 2017, the one on the right, which is very interesting. During the first decades of the 20th century, many cultural practices went underground, leaving some authorities to believe that the Tlingit had mostly abandoned their traditions and forgotten much clan knowledge. In 1939, as part of Roosevelt's New Deal to put the unemployed at work, the WPA initiated a project in Southeast Alaska to remove deteriorating poles that are still standing in old villages and transport them into larger communities. Carvers restored or copied the poles, which were re-erected in tourist-oriented totem pole parks. Many of these poles had originally stood on lands stolen by settlers or the government. The Tlingit took advantage of this program to signify their ownership of those lands, which of course, the government had no notion that they even knew that they had owned the land. These poles had become important players in the contentious and decades-long history of Alaskan Native land claims. With the international liberation movements of the 1970s, Indigenous people became more assertive about their rights, and some totem poles became political statements. For example, this 1980 Wushitan pole in Juneau memorializes a village which the US Navy bombed in 1882. Atop it stands Uncle Sam, symbolizing the country that never apologized for this atrocity. There's a theme here. For decades, the Tlingit have requested a formal admission of guilt from the government. But as far as I know, up until this point, they have not received one. However, in 2020, the Navy came to Juneau and began discussions about reconciliation and healing for their actions. Today, totem poles throughout the coast, all the way in British Columbia and Alaska, still stand for clans. But many reference the devastating consequences of white settlement, the history of Indigenous resistance, the declaration of land ownership. There is insufficient time to discuss the various kinds of totem poles today, of which there are many. But I will end with two examples that you can see right here on campus at the fabulous new Burke Museum, which I urge you to go to because it's got a fabulous collection of Northwest Coast art. And the curator of Northwest Coast Art, Katie Bunmakuza, is sitting right there. And I thank her for being here to make sure that I'm saying all the right things about Northwest Coast Art. Then these two examples, these two poles are by Nathan Jackson and his son Jackson Paulus. They carved two versions of the bear mother story of a hunter who marries a bear and is killed by their offspring. Nathan's, the one on the left, is a traditional depiction of a clan-based pole. Jackson's, in contrast, presents a 21st version of the story as a metaphor of colonization. a dynamic composition, and violently dismembered body allude to outsiders' attempted, yet ultimately unsuccessful devastation of a rich and unified culture. Another political statement, and one that brings to light what happened in colonialism. In this far too simplified paper, I've suggested similarities between Lithuanian and Northwest Coast carved poles, both descendants of the ancient shamanic tree of life. Both initially serve as inwardly focused community values, one religion, the other clan. Foreigners then dominated Lithuanians and the Northwest people, as of course, in addition to all indigenous people. Never fully acquiescing to these foreigners, carved poles became expressions of resistance and maintenance of cultural traditions. Fortunately, Lithuania has become an independent sovereign nation, and these carvings are treasured components of their artistic heritage. Tragically, most Native Americans are still subject to discrimination, racism, and poverty. The Alaska situation is somewhat different, however, for in 1971, the United States government settled all Alaskan Native land claims. This was purely an economic decision because the United States wanted an oil pipeline between Prudhoe Bay and Valdez. They couldn't begin this pipeline until they had settled all the legal land ownership. And that's the only reason they did it. It was for the oil pipeline. Indigenous Alaskans received ownership of 40 million acres of land and money for the lands they had lost. The ultimate result was a political and economically empowered Native American population. And today in Southeast Alaska, there are more poles than there were in the 19th century. I'm not saying that Alaska Natives are not subject to discrimination and racism. They are, but they have a stronger economic and political power in Alaska than many Native American people do. So I hope I have demonstrated Lithuanian and Tlingit art have been used as political declarations over the years. Thus, they express similar concepts, even if separated by thousands of miles. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This was really, really interesting. Now, I'd like to invite Uldis Balodis, perspectives on language materials for dormant and endangered language communities in North America and Northern Europe.
Good evening, everyone. And first of all, I'd like to thank Uldis for organizing this wonderful panel today. As somebody who's a Baltic scholar, but also studies Native American languages, it's a very unique opportunity to be with other people from such a rarefied group. And so thank you very much for creating this opportunity. So I thought I would begin by talking a little bit about my own past, just because it really kind of creates the basis for why I've done the work that I've done. So I am a descendant of Latvian World War II refugees, but I grew up speaking Latvian. That's my first language. And I grew up speaking it in a situation that in time I would find is not unlike that of many people who speak endangered languages. So I grew up in Arizona, and basically the only people I was regularly in contact with who spoke Latvian were my family, and then some mostly elderly people in my community. So basically already at an early age, this connection with this kind of a language community was set. And today I'll be basically talking about very quickly 3 different language communities I've worked with over the years. And the core question I'm examining is, what kinds of materials do you create for languages that don't have very many speakers or maybe no speakers at all? So in the title of my talk, I have this term dormant languages. So when I wrote my dissertation, I have to say this was 10 years ago, which is already kind of unbelievable that it's been so long. But this was a term that I learned during that time because I wrote my dissertation on a dormant language, which is the Yuki language. And Yuki, as I'll show you on a map in just a moment, was historically spoken in Northern California in Mendocino County. And so a dormant language in the past would probably have been called an extinct language. But in many ways, this is a cruel term because it implies that once people don't use a language anymore in everyday life, that it basically loses its life entirely. But this is completely not true. Unfortunately, there's not enough time to cite many examples of basically any story of language obsolescence, so languages passing out of use. It's a many-layered process. And so even at a point where you no longer have everyday conversations going on in a language, that language still serves a purpose for cultural cohesion and often for conveying different elements of culture, even as it is no longer being used in everyday life. So a dormant language, to me, is a language that has meaning for a living community. And so in many ways, it has turned out that my life as a scholar is very much connected with such languages, as well as endangered languages in general, which are ones that have more speakers than dormant languages. So in my brief talk today, basically I thought I would show you some of my own work and which addresses a question that I'm specifically interested in, which is, what do you do for such a language? What kind of materials can you create, and what can you use to create learning materials or other informational materials for a language that you can't go out and collect more data on? So these are the communities I've worked on over the years. So in many ways, the one in the center, Livonian, is the one that I have the longest history with. So just as many people, I'm sure, with their research interests, mine stretch back years and years before I ever got a PhD or was even in college. So basically, when I was 16, I sort of asked myself one day, whatever happened to the Livonians? Because as a Latvian, you grew up always hearing about them, and yet I had never met a single Livonian in my life. And so I started an exploration of my own at that time through my kind of network of American Latvian connections. And I found a Livonian woman living in Pomona, California, which for me was not very far away from Arizona. And she sort of set me on this path. So of these three communities, Livonian is native to Latvia. It's a Finnic language. To the right, you see Lutsi. This is the language I've worked on since I got my PhD. And it is a language actually that is not native to Latvia. It's an immigrant language. So this community came to Latvia at a point in time that is not completely clear. So it seems like at least 3 or 4 centuries ago. But my own belief through my own work is that the Lutsi language came to Latvia through a series of different migrations of various size. And Lutsi is also Finnic, and it is a variety of South Estonian, so specifically close to Setu, if you're familiar with these languages. And then the community on the left, that's Yuki. So this is what I worked with for my dissertation. And Yuki has really only one close relative also in California, the Wapo language. And Yuki, well, actually I'll show you on the next slide. So now I'll show you the 3 different things I've created over the years. And I included a link on each slide where you can actually access these materials for free if you're interested. So for my dissertation, I worked with these texts on the left. So these were spoken by Yuki speaker Ralph Moore. And for each of these slides, I really wanted to honor the speaker who gave their language for these materials, because without them, none of this would be possible. So I would like to thank Ralph Moore for sharing his language knowledge with us. But the linguist who recorded it was Alfred Kroeber, who was sort of an early and seminal linguist in the history of American linguistics in general. So those who are more familiar with anthropology may also know the book that Alfred Kroger's wife wrote, Ishi, the Last Yahi. So Ishi was the man who came down in, I think, around 1918 from the mountains near San Francisco. And it was kind of a story that was somewhat mythologized, but in any case, Kroger also recorded Ishi's language. But in any case, so what I created with Yuki was, since it was my dissertation, I wanted to write a reference grammar, so a scientific work that would give this language the future to the research community. But at the same time, I didn't want to create something that would be weighed down by jargon or by too much, I guess you could say, linguistic mumbo jumbo. So basically what I wanted to do is I wanted to create a professional work that would also be accessible to people who weren't specialists. And so my grammar is written in that way. So it's basically a theory-free approach, and it's also being used now as a resource for the Yuki language community, the Yuki language program that is beginning in the Yuki community in Northern California. So this is one approach. You can take these sorts of notes and you can create a scientific work that still gives you a clear enough description of the language that also people who are, of course, very knowledgeable, but not linguists, can use to create other valuable language materials. So the second community, this is a work that I published in 2020. So Litsi is this South Estonian variety that I worked with pretty much over the last decade. So this is Litsi speaker, Tekla Yaroshenko. And this is one of many wonderful archival photos that's found at the Estonian National Museum. And more or less, so these materials are often published. So there's, and you see on the left there, basically they're texts that were collected by Estonian researchers in the 1920s and 1930s primarily. And so I've taken them, and what I created for the Litsi community is, and I really urge you to, even though it's in Latvian, I urge you to go to this link and download it. It's kind of a multifaceted guide to Litsi language and culture. So my thinking was I wanted to place the language in its cultural and also place context. So when you look at the Litsi primer, this is one part of it that I show you here. So this is showing modeling sentences. It has a grammatical sketch and also a topical dictionary. So the idea is that you can learn groups of words that are logically connected, as well as basically a little phrase list, so you can incorporate a little bit of Litsi in your everyday life. But at the same time, also archival photos and modern photos that I've taken over my years of field work in the Litsi area that show basically where this language lived and how it existed. So again, please go to the Litsi primer. So the last work I'll talk about is one that I'm not the author of, and actually one of the compilers is here in the second row, wǝtëǝbʔaltxৱ, and our other colleague, Dian at the University of Tartu. So this is the Livonian, Estonian, Latvian dictionary published about 10 years ago, but it's a project that is continuing to be expanded on an ongoing basis. So currently, it is also available online, and I included a link that takes you to the dictionary. It too is based on sort of linguistic documentation, a lot of it from this speaker, Peter Gandai. But more or less kind of like my own work, what it does is it takes this documentation and it makes it accessible to people who wish to work with, who wish to learn Livonian or also study it scientifically. And it also takes this information and breaks it down and gives you grammatical details that are very important if you want to study Livonian. My own connection with it is that now I'm adding English translation to it, so that'll open it up to a wider community of scholars, while also actually making it available to those members of the Livonian community that have assimilated into languages other than Latvian. So finally, just kind of my core points that I felt I wanted to address in my short talk today. Basically, that archival documentation offers a wonderful opportunity for creating materials today for languages that no longer have speakers or only very few speakers. And also that this older documentation, it gives modern communities access to the kind of richness and language that existed in the past. And then the final point, which is just my own kind of wish, is that these materials are made not just for scholars, but also for everyone. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me invite Indrek Park. What is indigeneity? Perspectives from 3 continents. This will be our last presentation.
Oh, hello, everybody. In 1851, the government of Imperial Russia decided to compile a complete list of all the animals that lived in the Russian Empire. This was quite a popular undertaking back then. All colonial empires did similar things, France, Great Britain. So this huge undertaking was tasked to a Russian entomologist and zoologist called Yulian Simashko. It took him quite a few years to get the whole work out. It was published between 1856 and 1861. And the book was called The Fauna of Russia, a complete description and a complete description of all the animals of the Russian Empire. Among other things, starting from all the insects and ending up with birds and animals, also indigenous peoples, as was common back then, were depicted in this compendium. So the indigenous people beginning from the very east, Alaska, and ending up with the west of the Russian Empire. So we have the regular suspects who would expect there, the native people of Alaska, different Eskimo Aleut groups, Chukchi, Samoyedic people, and Estonians and Latvians in the very west. So back in 1851, Estonians and Latvians were considered aboriginal or indigenous. Lithuanians, interestingly, are not there. So Lithuanians were considered on a different level of civilization. And I suppose Russians, knowing that Lithuanians had once conquered Moscow and controlled large swaths of Russia, you can't really be conquered by a bunch of savages. So Latvians, yes, Estonians too. And actually there is also an interesting juxtaposition between Latvians and Estonians. Estonians look really savage, like they didn't know how to cut hair, and way more hair than I do. So Latvians were a little more grouped. So back then, obviously, Estonians and Latvians for the rest of Europe were indigenous or aboriginal. Now, 150 years later, Livonians are considered indigenous. So are the Setu people in Estonia. But Estonians and Latvians, for most people, interestingly not. So what has happened in the meantime? By the way, January 1st this year marks the beginning of a decade of indigenous languages proclaimed by UNESCO and the United Nations, which lasts from January 1st this year until the end of December 2032. So it's a decade. Interestingly, it lasts 12 years. I don't know why. According to the United Nations, well, I'm a linguist by trade, so I mostly will focus on language. According to the United Nations and UNESCO, there are approximately 7,000 languages in the world. 200 of those are spoken by 90% of the global population, just 200. And 96% of world's languages are spoken by only 3% of the global population. So most languages are really small and tiny, have less than 10,000 speakers per language. According to the UN, most of these languages, small languages, are spoken by indigenous people. And actually, the United Nations has also come up with a number of indigenous people. Last year, the last figure I saw was 370 million globally. And I've tried to find the source for this number, but haven't ever been able to. This year they changed the number. Now it's 476 million. So again, I have no idea where this number comes from. So who are the indigenous people? According to dictionary definitions, they are culturally distinct ethnic groups whose members are directly descended from the earliest known inhabitants of a particular geographic region, and to some extent maintain the language and culture of the original peoples. And sometimes it's added that they must have lived in a certain location for at least 5 generations. There are almost no international definitions who indigenous people are. So we only have dictionary definitions. So the 3 definitions that I'm aware of come from the International Labour Organization, and then recently, 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Mostly, according to the ILO and the UN, the indigenous people are long description. There is really no definition. Basically, they have to be marginalized. It's better if they have been colonized, and it's better if they're still being dominated by somebody else. So it's really a socioeconomic description. So if you're marginalized, you're dominated by somebody else, and then the UN will come and tell everybody that your rights have to be respected. So exactly who is part of the indigenous peoples is disputed, but can broadly be understood in relation to colonialism. What happens to an indigenous group if they become an independent nation? Well, it looks like they stop being indigenous. This has happened all over the Pacific, for example. So the moment you become a sovereign country, suddenly you don't get treated anymore indigenous. So paradoxically, as long as you're colonized and marginalized, all the international organizations will come and help you protect your land rights, water rights, hunting rights, and so on. The moment you become independent, suddenly you have to give everybody a level playing field, free market economy. Unless you become independent and you still remain a minority in your own country. For example, Fiji. The native Fijians, once Fiji became independent, they numbered less than 50% of their own country, and they are still considered indigenous. Actually, that's not completely true, because I think last year they broke like 50 or 51%. So it'd be interesting to see what happens now. So countries like Latvia and Estonia, which regained independence in 1991, are people still indigenous? What happens to areas like parts of Estonia and Latvia where Estonians and Latvians are a minority in their own country? Are they indigenous there? So there is a lot of questions here. I have worked in native communities in North America for the past 16 years, and before it in Tibet and Siberia. So the question of indigeneity comes up all the time. For example, let me give you a good example. If I go to a reservation, any reservation here, and claim to be indigenous, people would just laugh and tell me to look in the mirror. When Sami people come to visit, Lapps from Northern Scandinavia and Finland, they get the same treatment. The moment they put on their national clothes, suddenly it's a whole different thing. They are indigenous and treated as one of their own. Same thing with Setu people in Estonia. I have a good friend who is the temporary like the king of Setu people, who is a member of the United Nations Permanent Panel for Indigenous People. And he sits there with Amazonian natives, Papuans, and so on. But in order to emphasize his indigeneity, he will have to wear his clothes too. Are Germans indigenous to their own country? According to the dictionary definition, yes, but somehow we all got a feeling, we have a gut feeling that no, something is fishy there. Are Germans, French, Spanish, are they indigenous in their own countries? There are many more complications. So let's stick to the definition that's been given by the United Nations, that you have to be marginalized and so on. But even so, things are not simple. What makes you an indigenous group, ethnic group, any group? I would say it's language, culture, territory, continuous occupation of a territory, genes, identity, really important. But, so we have these 5 categories: language, culture, territory, genes, identity. But all these can change. We know that languages can travel between groups. We know that with intermarriage, the gene pool can completely be replaced. We know that languages can be revitalized, even hundreds of years after they disappeared. We know that people can be removed in this country to, for example, to Oklahoma. How many groups? Dozens of groups. We know that the colonizers can become colonized. Aztecs, the Nahua speakers in Mexico, the Quechua speakers who are the descendants of the Inca, and they were despised 500 years ago, but now they are indigenous. And obviously, I think it's a fairly easy case in the Americas that the people who lived here before contact, before Columbus, they are indigenous. End of story. But the rest of the world, it's much, much more complicated. There's a lot of gray areas. Think of all the Tungusic people in Siberia. They live in teepees, travel around, hunt, fish. But one group of them decided to give it all up. And in 1644, they conquered China, an indigenous group, the Manchu people. And, you know, an indigenous group suddenly runs China until 1911. And now suddenly they become indigenous again. There are only like maybe 12 or 13 people who speak the language. Another example of gray areas. Finns and Sami. Sami are indigenous, Finns are not. Okay. So there is a lot of categories or subsets, that combinations of those categories who can be indigenous. I myself have come up for Europe and other places with a comfortable size of territory. Again, Americas is a very different place because people were deported here to Oklahoma, for example, Indian territory. We know that these people, even though they don't live in the ancestral territories, they are still indigenous. Start with an example of Finland and Estonia. Finland and Estonia right now are probably undergoing the largest ecological destruction in Europe. Trees are being cut, forests are being cut. About close to half of Estonian private forests belong to foreign companies or foreign individuals right now. And I think if there is anything that unites Estonians, regardless of the political leanings and outrages them, is what's going on in the forest. Actually, in Finland, there is even more devastating going on in the forest, but Finns somehow seem to take it really easy. And I think when it comes to indigenous groups, what really matters is size, language, territory. When I travel around in Estonia, it's relatively small. It's almost like a reservation. So when somewhere a forest is being clear cut, or there are visible changes in the landscape, I will recognize it regardless of what part of Estonia I'm in. So Estonia is just so small that I have relatives and friends everywhere. Compare that to Finland. Finland is one of the largest countries in Europe, and they just don't have the same sense when you see visible changes in landscape. Now speak of Germany, or speak of Britain, or America. You know, you can pretty much mess up a place and then go to a different part of the country and then start over and just repeat this cycle. When you look at indigenous territories, if it's open spaces like prairies or tundras, they can be fairly large, but people usually will know if something happens to their traditional lands. Whereas nation states that exceed a certain limit, you will not be able to do it. Obviously, you also need continuity of identity. Estonia still speaks the same language that we spoke 100 years ago, but if you look at culture, I mean, we probably understand any, modern culture. We're probably on the same page with most Brits and Germans and Russians and French. And if somebody forced us to live in the 1850s Estonia, that would be like an alien world. But we know that there is a continuity of identity. So we see the same thing also in the Americas. Languages may change. I work with 3 Native American languages closely, and you can see that the gene pool is being replaced. It changes. Less and less people speak languages. Culture, obviously, is not the same anymore as it was in the 1900s Buffalo hunting. But what we have is this continuity and attachment to a particular piece of land. For me, the importance of indigeneity in the world is, if something happens in the world, it's the indigenous people who can show us how to keep on living. If we cannot become better human beings in a very, very abstract sense, to treat the whole world as if it was our home, then probably being organized into very small groups, ethnic groups, indigenous groups, territorial groups, is probably one of the eco-friendliest or eco-social forms of organization that are possible if we want to keep this planet. It's a huge topic, a lot of questions. I hope I raised some questions, and I'm not able to answer them all, but hopefully it will give you all food for thought. Thank you.
So right now I would like to invite our discussant, Dian, and she will raise some questions. And after that, we'll ask all of the panelists back on stage to respond to the discussant's comments.
Dianita, I'm welcoming you. So Uzra, Dian Million, Pagatili and Slan, Quintana Eat and Lan, Setsu, Abby Silas, Bauzra, Setsuya, Noah Albert, Bauzra, Son, Senzak, Nancy Holman, Bauzra, Seto, Rex Holman, Bauzra, Shinokaya, Setya, Angie, and Juanita. I have 4 great-grandsons and 4 great-grands. Alger Washington Desto. Otsiam to those whose lands I now live on in peace. And Osiam to the Luktamish and Swinomish, who are like family to me. So my name is Dian Millian, and I am Kanana Athabaskan. I'm an Alaska Native, and we have something in common in that Russia invaded us too. So I just jotted down some notes. I'm actually not, it's too late at night for me to get too critical or to ask really good questions. Although all of these papers, of course, beg for much longer discussion. But I want to give and honor all the speakers here tonight for giving us their research and from their hearts, their thoughts. So I'd like to first speak to Astrida Onat of the role of archaeology, not only where she returned to in her homelands, but also for the many, many years she spent among my neighbors, the Swinomish peoples. And I think what's really striking about is the open-mindedness, even though Astrida begins archaeology in a moment in time when people are telling her that we have no truth among us. And there isn't any peoples on earth that have no truth among them, who do not know anything about who they are, how they came to be. And, I was struck by the last paper because there's so many relations between that and that kind of statement sometimes, okay, about whether or not we know who we are. And I would say we do, for many different reasons. And one of them is anybody who has ever been invaded by another country or a series of countries for as long as we have knows what it's like to have been raped, to have been forced into or assimilated into different languages, into different racial groups, etc. But we're not racial groups. We're the existing nations of these lands. We're the still existing nations of these lands. And so that's how I liked what Astrida said, because what it is that she showed up with humbleness, which is a good thing among us. She went to, in humility to the elders, and I have great respect because she was able to identify and be of use to them, to actually document something as simple as this thing that I'm doing here, or you see these figures behind you doing. It's one of the oldest things that we do in this country here, and that we hold up our hands like that, or we learn to hold up our hands from the Coast Salish peoples here, because it means we welcome you. We're going to take care of you. So yes, so at any rate, I just wanted to thank Astrida for that, and also for her many long and patient years of understanding that the actual stories that the elders tell actually do create worlds. And no, there's no generation of any peoples on earth that are exactly the way they were 100 years ago. So there's definitely change always among all peoples, and our stories change too, just like your stories change, because we're making worlds, are we not? So that's how I do questions. So Aldona, is that? Yeah, okay. Does a beautiful job in showing something that I thought was like really striking, and it's this human need to touch the sky, to make a relation with the sky. And so these poles, or these things that we erect, actually are in some respect to go up, because we're trying to reach greater power there. And so that is something that was illustrated really beautifully in the ways in which, of course, again, and I'll try to be continuous here, the stories, again, there's a world making here, that even though in invasion, even though under duress, the pole making never stops. Even though people have been assimilated or forced into a different religion, the pole making never stops. The actual indigenous knowledge of that is absolutely striking to me. So at any rate, yeah, one of the things about going into Alaska, especially in Skidegate and all those areas, Haida, Kauai, and all the way the Kwapkiro and all those folks, Tlingit, all of those folks who do potlatch, who have that potlatch tradition. I always when I think of the poles, it reminded me, it's not just, what they can say yesterday or today, but how many relations are being told there. Because the poles never exist without the story, but the story has a lineage, and the lineage has responsibilities,
And the lineage includes everything living there and everything we see or cannot see or know or not know there. And that's how deep the relationships are there. So the poles are symbols of that. And I think that we can draw those same kinds of, correlations even between the poles that you saw in other places, is that there's always the relations there that the pole itself speaks to, that I don't want us to forget. For Uldis Balodis, I'm sorry, I apologize. I didn't get to practice names very well before I had to do this. One of the things that strikes me about this is because we are in a moment in time when we're losing most of the world's languages. And just think how much this impoverishes all of us, because languages are not just names for things, we know that. Languages create worlds, which was kind of the theme I got on early on. And so each and every place that we can recreate, you know what I'm saying, any place through its original language, what we're really doing is we're saving worlds and worlds of knowledge that we need very badly right now. And that's my opinion about it. One of the things that I loved was, the word Athabascan, even when I was a little girl, nobody told me I'm Athabascan. Because it's an anthropological name. And so we never said that word. We said Tananom, or we said something else, Pukatili. And I was just thinking, though, what's so funny about, this conversation about relations, if you can follow me here, one of the things is funny about Yuki is Yuki may be only, for instance, related to another language kind of close by or something, but it is not alone, because if Yuki has any relation to other Athabascan languages, it's all over Alaska, into Canada. There's little droplets of it all the way down through Washington, Oregon, into Northern California, and then bigger droplets of it until you get down into Dinnitah, which is Navajo country, and then in Geronimo country, where you again, you find the Apache peoples. We're all Athabascans, so we travel. We travel. We travel and we transform places as we go. Our language has always done that, and it's always a different language, because if you're, I always learned that the longer you are in a place, you know what I'm saying, the more languages you actually produce there, or the more variations of language you speak. So it means we've probably been here on this continent for a very long time, wandering around, except where we don't wander. We had purpose. So Indrek Park brought me to, a really good basic question, because even we balk at the word indigenous, mainly because it is so abstract. Our own idea of ourselves is not abstract. And you have to really look really closely at, and Indrek brings out some of the real complex ways in which it's really difficult. The complexity of the process that brought the concept of indigeneity into place has a history. And it's a Western history for the most part, not our history. I don't think any of us would have called ourselves indigenous. So one of the things that I know about this is that it is not, it actually, when I heard that they were putting all of us together, many of your own peoples, and my home peoples together, and thinking that was an insult to list us with the flora and the fauna and the non-human. To us, that would have probably, we could probably get behind that or raise our hands to the idea that we were relations, because our relations in a place would have included all of those categories, but not as an exclusion. And I think that's the point that Indrek's saying is that we have become a category of the excluded, and excluded from what is my question here. So, and we argued actually, Indigenous peoples who came together, who had self-declared themselves Indigenous, came together for 35 years to try to get an agreement about what it is. And we came down to one S on the end of a word: peoples. Peoples. We are peoples. And that acknowledges our languages, but also acknowledges our place. And so one of the things that I think about human rights, because I'm a little bit critical of human rights, even though as we reach out to human rights to attempt to actually protect us, I'm not quite sure that's the place to go to get protected, because human rights has become a dumping ground for the people who have no rights. So I have a real short piece here I'm going to share with you, and it's not finished yet. I've been trying to, I've been really trying to write about this, and I actually have a piece that's coming out in which I talk about indigeneity in a particular way as a spirit or an ethos, rather than as an identity. Place has a specific meaning in an Indigenous sense. Glenn Coulthard describes place as a way of knowing, experiencing, and relating with the world. And these ways of knowing often guide forms of resistance to power relations that threaten to erase or destroy our senses of place. I suggest that indigeneity is foremost a practice, a governance, ontologically and epistemologically lived within places that are not imagined as static. Indigeneity is a global practice in living that liberal humanism, racial capitalism has tried to eradicate from the earth for over 500 years. Indigeneity posits ways of living that create governances that are never the same across places or times. Indigenous practices emerge specifically within a set of relations that are material, spiritual, and dynamic. Indigenous practices form governances, not nation states. Our peoples have variously expressed their ontology, their premise for being as a set of relations where all are sentient and possessing agency. That means the flora and the fauna. And this building. Indigeneity strives to create relations of care and reciprocity, understanding the interdependence of all in a place with a shared goal of thriving in a place without destruction. This is governance that seeks to continue the conditions for all life. This is the core of what became understood as indigeneity globally, the often expressed caretaker relations of peoples with land, denying a singular understanding of land as property. Land is not property, it is part of a relation, and land is not the entirety of any relations as they are understood in any place. In North America, this living dynamic became reduced and severed by the racialization of myriad peoples into a managerial identity of Indian or Aboriginal. Some of us have argued that when Indigenous peoples' governing epistemologies are reduced to capitalist schemes of recognition, this forecloses what our larger legacy as peoples point to. So that's part of a piece that I've been writing about indigeneity. And I thought that I would share that with all of you tonight. I think the part that I'm trying to get to about making relations, intentional kinship relations, that I've also been talking about lately. This last few days, I've been speaking a lot about it. And that is that in any place, we must make relations to save these places, that we must work across our differences and understand that right now, that there is no place, wherever you are at, you have responsibilities in that place to become part of a set of kinship relations that actually is for life and not for its death or destruction. So I welcome you here to these, but it's not my place. It's our Post Salish people's place to actually welcome you here. But I, as also as a person who's come from another place, acknowledge my relations here in peace and salute you tonight and hope you have a great conference. Basi Cho and Abasi.
Thank you so much for these wonderful words, and we will continue our discussion tomorrow. There will be a film showing again tomorrow, and we can continue to dwell on these wonderful ideas. Unfortunately, we are running out of time for this event. However, I would like to invite everybody to AABS rooftop reception, which will take place from 9 until 11 p.m. And it's in the Graduate Hotel on the 16th floor with a beautiful view. And we would like to invite you to try the signature AABS conference cocktail, which will be with the cash bar. So thank you so much to the audience. Thank you so much to the speakers. Very interesting presentations. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about.